Okay, well, it hasn't changed any, so we'll just get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tanner Hoversland. I'm with Moore Farmers Oil here in Moore, Montana. I've been here with Moore for about 13 years as the agronomist. I've been on the MABA board for 3 years, just starting my fourth. I'll be your moderator this morning. I'd like to thank you all for participating in the MABA Great Montana Ag Rally. This is a great series of 1-hour educational workshops to help our membership to continue to stay informed and up to speed on the latest technology and information. I'd like to thank Montana Sulfur for their support of the rally and in sponsoring this session. Now we'll get started with session one. Generally, we'll have a video or somebody from Montana Sulfur will come on and give a little speech. However, we were unable to connect with them and get a video prior to, but just so you know, Montana Sulfur Chemical Company, Montana Sulfur and Chemical Company is a leading sulfur manufacturer in Billings, Montana. They manufacture sulfur and sulfur-based products for agricultural and industry. Their fertilizer products meet or exceed the toughest standards for the commercial or organic grower, as well as the backyard gardener. So with that, let me introduce our first speaker. It's Dr. Kent McVay, the Southern Ag Research Center. Kent McVay is the Extension Cropping Systems Specialist for Montana State University. He's located at the Southern Agricultural Research Center near Huntley. He works both in dryland and irrigated production systems, focusing on the use of rotations, cover crops, and reduced tillage for sustainability. Research projects include impact of cover crops on grain production and soil quality, water use and efficiency of pulse crops, and evaluating low protein genetics in malt barley cultivars. He annually manages 20 off-station variety trials for winter wheat, spring wheat, barley, dry pea, lentil, and chickpea in cooperation with the 4 breeding programs located on the MSU campus at Bozeman. So here's Dr. Kent McVay.
Well, thank you very much, Tanner. Good morning, everyone. And if I can get this screen set up so that I can see what I'm talking about. So first disclaimer, I'm not the nutrient management specialist. That's Clayton Jones. They asked me to do this. And so Clayton shared a slide set with me about canola, and then I modified it to try and talk about all the different oilseed crops. So some of these slides are originally Clayton's and quite a few of them are mine. We'll just get started. If I can go forward. There we go. So optimum soil conditions for oilseed crops are pretty much like all crops. You know, the better you've got, the better soil you have, the better potential productivity you have. So soil with adequate infiltration and aeration. Salt content might be the one thing to think about. It's probably similar to what the grass crops would be, like small grains, wheat, and barley. A lot more tolerant than pulse crops to salt and soil conditions. Minimum till is a good way to go with oilseed crops, especially the small seed crops.
Doctor, I think we're not seeing your slides.
Let's start over. Soils with adequate infiltration aeration. We talked about these things. The minimum till where I was at. Minimum till or no till is a really good idea for especially the small seeded crops like mustards or canola, flaxseed, because you don't have as much issue with crusting and that kind of a thing. And then, you know, in a high diverse rotation to interrupt disease cycles, especially if you're in their no-till system. I'm going to use this IPNI's 4R Plant Nutrition as a guide for this talk. So IPNI is the International Plant Nutrition Institute. I didn't know if they still exist, but they were a pretty good source of information, and it's a really good guide. If you don't have it, you might look for it. The version I have is 2012. Anyway, they have the 4 R's, which was the right source, the right rate, right timing, and right placement. And Clayton added a 4th R for rotation. So you look down here, these puzzle pieces of source, rate, time, and place, and you squeeze in rotation into these. There should be 5 puzzle pieces that will give you the best environmental, economic, and social decisions for using fertilizer and to managing fields. So we'll just go through this way and use this as a guide. So right source. So basically, first, let's just talk about what mineral constituents are in crops. And so this is basically for all crops, not just oilseed crops. Of course, the main component of the crop would be carbon. But if you look at on nitrogen as one of the 16 essential nutrients, let's say the plant has 1 million atoms of nitrogen, it would have about 60,000 in comparison to that million in phosphorus, potassium around 250,000, and calcium about 1/8, magnesium 80,000 compared to the 1 million in nitrogen. And sulfur kind of drops off, it's down there 30,000. And the micros like chlorine, iron, boron, manganese, zinc, copper, molybdenum, nickel would range from 1 to 3,000 parts per million. So by far, nitrogen is the most important fertilizer. It's the macro, NPK would be the 3 that we would typically think about fertilizing for ag production. Sulfur for oilseed crops, since it's a pretty good component, it's kind of it's not a macro and it's not a micro, I call it a meso, kind of in the middle, would be an important component, especially for oilseed crops. But one thing I want you to notice about this is the form that all these are taken up are on ionic form. So nitrogen gas in the air is not accessible to plants. It has to be in the mineral form of nitrate or ammonia. And nitrate is, most crops take nitrogen up as nitrate. And the main source of that is from organic matter. The decomposition of organic matter, the nitrogen is released from the organic fraction of previous crop residues. Same thing for phosphorus. Phosphorus is tied up in organic matter and released. You can also add as mineral, both of those actually as mineral fertilizers. In this stage, there's not a lot of potassium needed. We have really rich soils in potassium. Calcium and magnesium, you would probably never fertilize these kind of fields. It's rare that you would ever use calcium and magnesium as a fertilizer or need it for fertilizer. We're just really rich in those kind of minerals just from the parent material that we have to work with. And sulfur would be something that's also going to come from organic matter, and or you can add it as a fertilizer. The micros, because they're such a small part of plants, typically you're not going to need to add micros. And so I think if you really focus on the NPK and sulfur, that's probably the main thing to look at for crop production in oilseeds. This is a slide Clayton put together. In Montana, our source of nitrogen is pretty much urea. And so this is a slide comparing other sources to urea. And the main problem with urea, anhydrous ammonia was probably a better source. It's 82% nitrogen. The urea is 46%, and it's a lot safer to handle, and that's probably one of the reasons the industry has moved to that. But the one thing that urea comes with is volatilization loss potential. If you can put it into the soil at a couple inches below the soil surface and seal down that soil, you really don't, volatilization is not going to be an issue. It's really an issue when it's spread on the surface. So as compared to other sources like ammonium nitrate or calcium ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate would be less of a volatile issue, because urea is actually an organic compound. It has to be broken down through urease and then microbially turned into nitrate, and it goes through the form of a gaseous form of ammonia with that process. So when it's in that gaseous form, if it's free to the atmosphere, you can lose significant amounts to the atmosphere. So ammonium nitrate and calcium ammonium nitrate is already in the nitrate form. So what the nitrogen part of that is just going to go as it'll be available. Once it hits the soil and goes into the soil solution, both ammonium would be attached to the CEC of the soil, and ammonium nitrate is an anion, so it will move with water, but it would not go through that ammonia phase. UAN is 50-50 urea and ammonium nitrate, so there's a little bit less volatilization potential with it. There's things you can add to UAN or to urea, like NDPT, agrotane, or Inserve, or the combo Super U of those two. And agrotane would reduce the volatilization loss. Inserve really kind of protects it from leaching loss for a period of time. Doesn't really do anything to protect it from volatilization loss. And then there's ESN, a polymer-coated urea, and that tends to reduce it both volatilization and leaching. But it also keeps it less available over time. So in our environment in Montana, ESN if you apply in the spring, you may not have it be released in time for crop uptake. And so that's kind of an issue, I'd say, with ESN. Slow release Nitrogen, I don't know much about this one, so I don't know, apparently Claim didn't know a lot either. So I think that's it for that. So I guess the main thing is you're going to base your nitrogen choice on price more than anything. And placement would be the other issue. If you want to be able to put it in with the seed, you may pick a different source because of that. Phosphorus sources are basically, most of the modern sources all come from phosphoric acid. They're just being put into different forms. Some dry, like 1152 and 1846O. Some as a liquid, like 1034O. But it basically all come from phosphoric acid that's put into, so take actually rock phosphate and they dissolve that and put it in products that we can use. So I don't think there's much rock phosphate available in this country, but I once lived in Missouri and there was a big argument about using rock phosphate as a fertilizer source for phosphorus. But this slide I got from Minnesota shows, I think the easy way to understand this is it's not soluble. So if it's not soluble and it does it in an ionic form, you can't get it into the plant. And so the other option, so these modern ones, it doesn't really matter which one you use, but manure is a really good source of phosphorus, very rich in phosphorus and potassium. And so if you're in a, maybe you have cattle production or you have an easy source of manure, if you're in an annual application of manure, you can really build soil phosphorus levels up that way. And it's a very good way of doing it, but not everybody has access to it. And the manure, the concentration varies quite a bit. So if it's a one-time application of a lot, you'd probably be best to get an analysis of that to know kind of what you're putting on. If you're in an annual application, probably less, you'll just see it in your regular soil sampling. Time and again, the different modern phosphorus sources have been tested, and there's really no significant difference due to source. So they basically will be based on price and then the way you want to handle that fertilizer. If you want to use liquids or you want to use dry. What about a veil? So a veil is a product that it can be applied with phosphorus or on phosphorus to try and keep it more available. That's the name of veil. And that's been around for at least 10 years. And a lot of these products come along and don't really, some of them come along. This has been around a while, but I think it's worth talking about. We don't really, some of them come and by the time we get the research done on whether they work or not, they've moved on. And so you don't see them anymore. And that they made their money and moved on. But a recent research paper, I think it was 2019, looked at 500 field evaluations and showed using a veil, it ended up with an average yield increase of 2%. But then when they carried it down and looked at just at the ones where soil tests were low in phosphorus, that average yield increase came up to 4.6%. So their final conclusion from that was the likelihood of response increased with low soil test phosphorus, low phosphorus application rates, and where the soil pH was extreme, either extremely acid or extremely basic. I don't get too excited about 5% increase. I think 5% would be nice, but I think you could probably get that by increasing the phosphorus application by 5%. So it's up to you. I think a veil, this does show there's some positives to using a veil. And basically the idea for a veil is to keep it from being absorbed onto surfaces like calcium and iron oxides that make it unavailable over time. Sulfur Source. So this is an interesting paper I found it's actually from India. It was reported in Australia at a conference, in Safflower conference. They had different sulfur sources. So they had a check plot with none. They had ammonium sulfate, elemental sulfur, and gypsum, which is calcium sulfate. And so as you can see, there's definitely a response to applying sulfur, but the difference in the low, there's 4 tests that were in low, and there's 4 tests in the medium soil test range. In the low, the best was ammonium sulfate. Elemental sulfur was not significantly different from that. In the medium soil test range, elemental sulfur was the high, not different from gypsum, and a little bit better than ammonium sulfate, but all of them better than a check. So it's interesting because in our environment, we wouldn't think elemental sulfur would be applied right before planting as a very good source. Elemental sulfur has to be oxidized and become available. It takes time for that to occur. Now, this is a subtropical region in southern India, so maybe that's a warmer, wetter environment, so those things turn over faster. So for them, maybe that's a pretty good source. But for us, we'd say if you're going to use elemental sulfur, you need to apply it 1 to 2 years ahead of the time you're going to go into that crop that needs sulfur, oilseed crop. About rate. So let's talk about rate for a second. How do you come up with a rate? Well, basically you need to know what you have, right? You need to know what the crop needs, but you also need to know what you have, and you do that by soil testing. So here's a picture of Clayton out in the field with a hydraulic probe. You can use a hydraulic probe or just push probes and figure out what your soil has and identify where you have imbalances or where there's really a poor spot in the field, or maybe do some contrasting between good and bad in fields to try and figure out what's causing that. And the cost of the soil sample is cheap compared to the cost of the amount of fertilizer you're going to buy for any field, right? It's just 15, 20 bucks for a soil sample. If you do maybe 1 every 40 acres it's not a lot of money within it. You get a lot of information, and especially having a plan in place to sample over time, you can kind of keep track and see if you're building phosphorus levels, what your nitrate levels are over time. P and K are always based on a 0 to 6 inch or 0 to 8 inch surface sample. And so all the calibrations for recommendations are based on that. But for nitrate and sulfate, things that move with water and move into lower depths, you need to sample those lower depths to see what you have. And so at least a 2 foot depth, we typically sample the 4 foot depth here at Southern. And especially in places where maybe you had a drier year, so the crop production, which you had fertilized for, you didn't reach the yield that you thought you were going to get. So you fertilize, some of that nitrogen can still be available, maybe it's at lower depth. Depends on your soils as well. If you got real shallow soils, maybe it's not going to be there, but you need to sample deep for nitrate and sulfate to see what's in the profile. Clayton would recommend soil testing in the spring, right before planting, because things can happen over winter to change what the results would be. In practicality, it's kind of tough to do that. I think most people sample in the fall because you've got an open period of time to be able to do it. In the spring, you want to get out and plant things as soon as you can. And so to wait, take samples, and then to get results back is not the best. So in conditions where you have high crop residue or high soil organic matter, the number you get from a fall sample might be under or might be over fertilizing what you really. There may be some mineralization that occurs in the winter that you weren't accounting for. Even like a winter like this winter, where it's been fairly mild up until the last 2 weeks, there's been probably quite a bit of mineralization occurring. And even now, I was looking at soil temperatures are stationed here, and they're right at freezing, 30, 31, 32 degrees. So there's mineralization still occurring right now, even though we were below zero for over a week here at Huntley. In shallow or coarse soils, you can have high precipitation over the winter, so what you measured in the fall may not be there in the spring to what you need for that crop, and so you could have under-fertilized. Basing your recommendation from a fall sample versus spring. So maybe one way to get around that, and this is what Clayton suggests, is maybe compare some fields sampling in the fall and then go back and sample them in the spring, and do that over a few seasons to kind of see how your soil, how your farm varies over time. And you have it come up with a fudge factor based on how the winter's gone on, whether you think you should or shouldn't believe those numbers. Maybe you should bump them up or bump them down depending on how the season's gone. That allows you to sample in the fall and get things moving. And then yield goal makes a difference too, right? Especially for nitrogen recommendations. So the MSU statewide canola variety trials would be a good source of information for that. And you can find those results here at the Southern Ag Research Center or at Central Ag Research Center. Pat Carr puts that together each year. And so you can get copies of those to kind of see what yield potential is across the region, or talk to your neighbors and just figure out what is productivity in your region. Because past yields indicate future performance. And having the ability, this is having the ability for in-season in application, so a split application of nitrogen might be the most optimum way to do it. I don't know for what we're dryland production, whether it's really worth the extra trip to do that. But if you think about fertilizing for your minimum yield goal, you know what it looks like in the spring. So you want to fertilize to make sure what you definitely think you're going to get. You have the opportunity to go back, and if it's a really good season, go back and add a little more nitrogen or even a little sulfur later, you know, maybe an early vegetative period before it canopies, before flowering, to make up for that if conditions look really good. And if conditions stay dry, for example, and your minimum is met, then you save that amount of fertilizer cost putting on. So here's a copy of the 2017 canola variety trial, put together across the region from here, central, western triangle, northern, and eastern. So we have results through 2019. I've asked for the 2020 results. They should be here soon enough, and you can find them from my website here at sarkmontana.edu. So Montana State University fertilizer recommendations for nitrogen are based on yield goal. And so from the fertilizer guidelines for Montana crops, EB 161, I've taken the numbers for some oilseed crops and put them in here just for comparison. In that book, it's based on per bushel, but I've converted to pounds of nitrogen per pound of grain just for an easy comparison because there's wide differences in test weights of these crops. And you can see canola, it uses a lot more nitrogen than flax, for example, more than double the amount of nitrogen. It's similar to what spring wheat would want for nitrogen. Canola and mustard, you need to fertilize a pretty high rate of nitrogen. Safflower and sunflower are in between that. And soybean also uses a lot of nitrogen, but it's a legume, so you should be able to inoculate, if you're growing soybean, inoculate it and it'll fix the nitrogen that it needs. Phosphorus tests, we don't base on yield goal, we base it on the soil tests. But not only the soil tests, but what crop you're going into. So there's a table in that EB 161 for each crop. So assume say your soil test is an average of 8 parts per million. If you're going to canola, we'd recommend 35 pounds per acre. Safflower 30, sunflower 25, and on down the table. So for example, a canola example, a 1,200 pound yield goal, total nitrogen recommendation would be the yield goal times the nitrogen rate from this table over here. So 1,200 times 0.0633 should give you 76 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So that'd be, if you have the book, you can go through and do that. But if you don't want to use the book, or you don't have the book, you can come to my website and then under agronomy decision tools, open that up and you select fertilizer recommendation and click on that. And you get this input sheet. So this is basically a digital form of that book. And so you just fill in the blanks and hit submit, and you get a nitrogen recommendation that MSU would recommend. So zooming in on that, and I didn't go live on this just because it was the time. I didn't want to have it lock up into the website possibly. So let's assume we had a soil test of Olsen P at 8, extractable K 295 parts per million. If your results are in pounds per acre, some soil labs will report in pounds per acre. You just change this to match whatever your units are. 1.8% low organic matter. This section, the second section here is for nitrate. So if you've got, I put in 10, 4, and 2, and a 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and 12 to 24 inch depth. You can change these depths to match what you have. Or if you want, you can leave this alone and just leave it at zeros and then do the calculation from the next sheet. Last year's crop, look at the other when you do this. It mainly is legumes. If it's one of those, select those. If not, just leave it at other. So I put canola, 1,200 pounds per acre. You can change the units here, hit submit, and then you'll get a result like this. So NPK recommendation for fertilizer, 40, 35, and 15. Well, we just did this. And it was 76, right? So 40 is not 76, but if you come down to the second bullet, it says this recommendation includes a nitrate credit of 36 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So it'll calculate the nitrate credit. And actually for any nitrate that's below 2 feet, MSU gives you only 50% credit for that. And so if you had a 2 to 4 foot profile, you wouldn't get total credit for all the nitrate if you want to give yourself credit for that, I'd recommend leaving those at 0, and then just when you get your recommendation here, would say 76, and you say you've got 50 pounds already out there, then you would fertilize with 26. There's other notes down here that you need to read, so always read the notes below. So apply 20 pounds sulfur per acre as sulfate for each canola crop in a pre-plant application. So regardless of what the soil test is for sulfur, MSU is going to make a recommendation if it's canola to add sulfur. And I think that's probably a good recommendation based on some stuff I'm going to show you here in a little bit on response to sulfur for canola, especially for canola. And I showed you that one for safflower. It's interesting that we don't make that recommendation for safflower, but I think it's tempting for me to put out a study and see if I can see a response to with safflower to sulfur, because that was 8 locations. It looks like pretty good data. Another point, the nitrogen plus K2O potassium should not exceed 10 pounds per acre in furrow, and do not recommend putting any urea or DAP down with the seed. So these recommendations should be the same as you get from that book. If you're not using the book and you do Nitrograde Adjustments, if you're using my website, some of these are automatically included. So high levels of small grain stubble. So if you had a previous crop of wheat and had a really good yield and have a lot of stubble out there, should you adjust nitrogen rate? You probably ought to adjust it up. And the thumb rule, and that actually is in the book, I just didn't incorporate it under our web tool, is if for every 1,000 pounds of stubble, add 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre to what you're going to apply, whatever the recommendation is, up to a max of 40 pounds. If you're following fallow, assume that half of that stubble is decomposed over the previous year when adjusting. And I'd say, I don't think I would adjust if you're following fallow. I would just soil sample and see what you've got, because if it's decomposed and it's mineralized, you're going to pick it up with your deep sample prior to fertilization, and prior to growing the next crop. Soil organic matter, for each percent over 2%, you get a credit of 15 to 20 pounds. That's also in order, if you're over 2 on your input on that screen, it'll automatically adjust that. And then following legume rotations, should you adjust it up or down? Well, maybe you can adjust it down. If you get a credit for following a legume in the book or on the website, if you're following a pulse crop like peas or chickpea, it'll give you a 10-pound credit. Terry Miller and McVay have done some work there at Bozeman that showed that if you've been in a pulse grain crop for maybe 3 rotations prior, so maybe 10 years you've been growing wheat and pulses and oilseed, and you've had pulses at least 3 times, then maybe that credit ought to be more like 20 pounds per acre. Or if you've been using pulse as a cover crop and not taking it all the way to grain, then you're getting a little bit more nitrogen that's remaining out there that's fixed for that pulse crop, but it's not going anywhere. And so it should be available. So 1 or 2 times, you should get a 20 to 30 pounds. If you've been in that rotation maybe 10 years, 30 to 50 pound nitrogen credit. Alfalfa, I do have that in that. So if you tear up an alfalfa field and plant it, you ought to give yourself a 40-pound credit. There'll be quite a bit of nitrogen that comes out of that alfalfa field for 2 or 3 years following. So the other way you can fertilize, if you're testing high in phosphorus, you might want to apply what's being removed in the grain. So this is a table from that same book, and I've just put it in pounds per pound of NPKs removed in the grain. And actually, as a comparison, to look at nitrogen 3.88% compared to winter wheat 2.08. So it also N, P, and K, all 3 are quite a bit more nutrient scavengers canola is over what you would have for wheat. I added hemp seed in here. It's not in the book, and I put it in italics just because I'm not positive about these numbers. I forget where I got these 3 numbers. This number is actually a protein number on a federal database, and I just converted it to nitrogen, and it's a little high. I'm not sure if that's right. And hemp seed, that could be something that comes down the road. It's another oilseed crop that might be a good producer for us over time. So just as a comparison to look at these numbers for what's being removed in the grain. And so if you want to calculate it from this table, An example for canola for phosphorus removal would be, so you have a 1,000 pound per acre yield goal times 2.34 divided by 100, because this is in percent, you'd be 23.4 pounds of phosphorus per acre removed from in a canola plant. So you might want to fertilize based on removal if you're at the higher rate of soil tests. So this is data from Malahi and Gill in 2007 that showed that sulfur on the x-axis and canola seed yield on the y-axis, that if you're limited with sulfur, if sulfur is not available for that crop, it really can't take advantage of the nitrogen that you apply. And in fact, the yield actually drops at the check rate of no sulfur applied. And that may just be an impact of, nitrogen is going to be available. You've got a really poor growth of the crop. You're going to have competition from weeds and other things that are going to utilize that and really give competition. But as you increase sulfur, look at how the response to nitrogen jumps from 5 bushel to 20 to 25 bushel. These top 4 bars are probably not different. And so if sulfur is limiting, the crop cannot make use of nitrogen. So you need, canola especially needs to be fertilized with sulfur. If you've got really high tests, and around here, our soils are pretty heavy. We have sulfate tests in hundreds, so we don't typically see a response like that. But I know there, well, like where Tanner is at Moore, those areas typically have pretty low testing sulfur soils. And so be cognizant of that and apply to make up for that. This is that study from southern India, and these are the 8 locations testing low, and these are the low or medium testing. And you can see all of them responded to sulfur rates, and all but one of them significantly responded. So 25 to 48% yield increase. The average yield of those was this bottom line here, around 1,000 to 1,500 pounds per acre. And then I normalized this, dividing it by what it was with 0, so it's the relative yield. So at 0, those are all 1s because it's divided by itself. But the yield of 13 was a 6% increase, and up to 40 pounds per acre, they got a 25 to 48% yield increase. And even the one that was not significant showed a trend that way. I think it just was noisy enough I couldn't see the difference. And these soils are similar to what we have here. They're clay soils, pH 7 to 8. They put fertilizer 50 to 25, 50-25-0 on average across those 8 treatments for 8 years of the study, and then incorporated prior to planting. So this is safflower. So I think I'm kind of intrigued by that, and I think maybe we might look at this over time. Right now, I don't think we're making a recommendation for it, but it might be possible to see a response to sulfur with safflower. Timing. So we go to the third best management practice according to IP&I. What's the best timing? And so this makes a good time for you guys to put in your, have to pause here so you can put in your information, your name and license number in the chat box. So I'll give you 10 seconds to do this. And then we'll move on. So right timing. So we talked about this already. For sulfur, if it's sulfate, like ammonium sulfate, in the sulfate form, it should be available right away. It needs to be applied right at seeding. So this is actually from Clayton's book on sulfur for canola production, fertilizer for canola production. So if it's an elemental sulfur, it needs to be a couple of years ahead of time, just for that to become available. So applying it right at seeding, or even the fall ahead of seeding, most of that sulfur is not going to be available. And so you need to apply it early. There's a product, I think this Montana Sulfur sells, this rapid release elemental sulfur. I don't know much about it, but according to Clayton, you want to do it at least in the fall ahead of time. I think that's hedging to make sure that you don't run short on the sulfur you need for that crop production. So application timing, it really depends on the source, but that fertilizer that you apply, whether it's urea, whether it's sulfur, it needs to become available before you take it up by the plant. It also, it's kind of a double-edged sword. If you put it out there and it's available, but it moves with water like nitrate would do or sulfate would do, you don't want to lose it from the system. So this is canola plant growth along the x-axis and the percent of maximum uptake. So nitrogen for efficiency, for the highest efficiency, ideally a split application of 50 to 65% at seeding, and then adjust and apply it along the 5 to 6 leaf stage, the remainder of that nitrogen. I don't know that that's necessary to do it. Sulfur should be applied probably at seeding time. You can also do a rescue if you have to, but that's probably a more expensive way of doing it. Foliar after the 5th leaf emerges to minimize leaf burn. Phosphorus and potassium ought to be put down ahead of seeding. In fact, phosphorus, I think, is just something you should be managing long-term across crops, across years, and potassium for that matter, if you're in the responsive side. Applying it after flowering, it's too late and you're not going to get the response that you need. So it needs to come in this early stem elongation period, 5 to 6 leaf period for both nitrogen and sulfur. I think I would recommend just putting it down ahead of time. And it's not a huge amount like an irrigated production where a split application makes a lot of sense. Right placement. So this is just on urea with NPPT and Super U, a comparison to canola seed yield and nitrogen placement. If you place it deep, 2 to 4 inches, it doesn't matter whether it's been treated or not, you get the same results, the same yield. So all these A's say there's no difference across all these treatments. So if you're going to place it shallow or broadcast, then treating that with Super U or with NPPT can protect that from being a volatilization loss. That's really what this is showing. And so it can make it probably a 10 to 15% yield response. And some of the work that Rick Engel had done on that shows it really depends. You may broadcast and get a rain and have it incorporated and not have it, you may be just like this, no response if you get it into the soil. But depending on that rain and what really, rather than getting a half-inch rain all at once, you usually get level piddling rains, but it's almost the worst case scenario where you just get it to melt and it makes it available to volatilize. So early spring broadcast with incorporation would be the other way of doing it if you want it in the tilled system. If the seeder can't place it in deep, then consider NPPT. So UAN is also, it's less volatile than urea, but it can still volatilize. Half of that is still urea. And so putting it on a surface band has been some recommendation, but if you put it in a subsurface band, it's definitely you're not going to have the volatilization potential loss. Placement for phosphorus and potassium. P is critical to have it close to the seedling roots in the first 2 to 6 weeks. Ideally, if you can put it in a band just adjacent to the seed, not in the same seed slot, that's optimum. And when you do that, you really are not limited on how much you can put down. It's really important probably to have like starter phosphorus in most plants, and even when the Olsen test is in the medium to high range. 10 to 15 pounds of P2O5 per acre placed in with the seed or in a side band. If there's more required, you could broadcast incorporate before seeding, or you can, like I said, build a long-term plan to build phosphorus levels over time so that you're not in the low test range. Potassium can be placed with the seed, but you've got to limit how much you put in with the seed to less than 10 pounds of the total of K2O plus nitrogen. Or if you're in sandy soil, that limit ought to be 4 pounds per acre. And I've heard producers that do 20 pounds and you can get away with it. If you have moist soils, if you have rain afterwards, it's not usually a challenge, but I think this is on the conservative side, and once you get burnt, then it's probably a good thing if you're on the conservative side. So let's say you want to apply 10 pounds of phosphorus as 1152 with the seed. So 10 divided by 0.52, the concentration of phosphorus in that, it would be 19.2 pounds of product. 19.2 times the nitrogen gives you 2.1 pounds of nitrogen. So you can't apply 10 pounds of K if you're also putting phosphorus with it, or you're going to exceed this 10. So just keep in mind, if you're putting a 52 or a phosphorus source down with the seed, and there's nitrogen attached with it, calculate that value as well before you would add in potassium. So MAP, 5 to 20 pounds, P2O5 per acre per seed placed can be safe. DAP, we don't recommend using DAP. Liquids equally potent as MAP, but close proximity to BAM, the seed, higher risk to the seed. And then there's a new product. I don't know how available this one is, Coated Specialty P. I was reading about it yesterday. I don't know much about it. I think it's a lot like the ESN for urea, but I may be wrong. But look, it is a coated product, and so I haven't done enough research to know whether if phosphorus is available or not. But it should be safer with the seed. This is old data, 1969, but this is the real reason why you want to be careful on how much you put with that seed. So this is at 0 rates of phosphorus as MAP applied to the soil. It goes from 0 to 35, I think. The number of plants of the 0 phosphorus control. So at 0 is 100%. Let's come up. As you increase MAP, even in a 1 inch below the seed row, you see that the population drops down to 80, 82, 83% at the high rate. If it's this is below the seed row, if it's in the seed row, then you can really have a disaster and not have a stand from that. So it's really just putting salt in with the seed. And so it just depends on the conditions in the soil at the time. At high rates can be pretty dangerous. Now, if you have white openers on an air seeder, that you can bump up how much you can put on with the seed because you're spreading that into a wider band. So the amount of salt that's next to each germinating seed is less. So that would be one thing. And I think over time you can kind of figure out what works and what you can get away with for the equipment you have, the soils you have. Oh, I didn't go through these here. So actually, if you have, I would modify these results based on these conditions. A heavy clay soil is a lot more forgiving than a sandy, coarse textured soil. A high organic matter soil is a lot more forgiving than one that's low. High moisture is better than in droughty conditions right after fertilization, right after planting within furrow fertilizer. You can have some toxic conditions right then. And pH, low is more forgiving than high pH. There is a seed place rate calculator from IPNI, and I think it's also from the SDSU site. I just Googled it and found it at the seed damage calculator. And you guys will get copies of this afterwards if you want, so you can find that, or if you just search for seed place rate calculator, you probably can come up with the same one. It has all the different fertilizers in it, and you put in rates, and it gives you safe, you put in what you want to put down, and it gives you safe rates. It's a nice little calculator. So rotation, a little bit on rotation. I started a study here 2 years ago with a crop rotation study where I've got strips of winter wheat. This is safflower, this is barley, there's a fallow strip, this is chickpeas, this over here is peas. There's 11 different strips. And then 2020, we planted these same strips perpendicular to this. So we end up with each crop on each other crop on all different crop residues. And so this is just a subset of that. If you look at what's here for the flax, barley, safflower, winter wheat, pea, chickpea, and fallow, those are the strips in 2019. And then the columns, flax, safflower, barley, and winter wheat would be the 2020 crop. So this is flax on flax. So I've normalized this again. So flax on fallow, I divide everything by flax, the yield of flax on fallow. The total yield across all those plots was 626 pounds per acre. Safflower was 904. Barley was 3546, so about 60 bushel of barley and winter wheat. Yields of flax and safflower were kind of reduced because we had a lot of grasshopper damage last year. But anyway, looking at the rotation effect, flax on flax is a really bad idea. Just like safflower on safflower you don't want to do continuous oilseed on itself. That's usually the worst condition for the yield. But look at the following peas and chickpeas, probably a 6 to 14% yield bump, even better than following fallow for flax and safflower. For barley and wheat, it's best was following fallow, but actually following the peas for barley was 92% of that fallow, and even winter wheat was 88% of the fallow and decent yields. We had pretty much a normal rainfall year last year. So the reduction is probably water a lot, but some of it is previous crop residue. So if you're thinking, this is kind of data you can use to try and figure out a good crop rotation. And when's the best time to put a flax or safflower crop? If you're putting it after a pulse crop, that means you've got 2 years in a row of crops other than wheat or other than small grains in the rotation. So maybe the way to get to 2 years of small grain rotation, or 50% of the small grain rotation, if that's what probably most of us do, which is the wheat fallow rotation, it's 50% of the time. You could grow a small grain like barley or spring wheat, and then the following year, go winter wheat. Look at winter wheat on top of barley. It's 84% of that. And, if you're 50% or higher, you're getting the same total number of bushels. You're just doing it in 2 years versus 1 year. If you did that, you could go to a pulse crop after the winter wheat. I don't have the column pulse here, but those did decent. And then you can come back with an oilseed crop and then go back to that. So that'd be a 4-year rotation of a small grain, spring planted, winter planted, pulse, and then oilseed. Actually, I stole that idea from this study. It was done in Mandan, and this is a subset of their data. Shows kind of the same things. The oilseed canola following lentils and peas was 16% yield increase, and sunflower and safflower is double the yield that you got as compared to that growing on itself. So pulses, like I see here, similar type yields. This is just 1 year of data. This is 4 years of data. A lot more faith in this than what I have, but ours is actually here in Montana. This is over in Mandan, so a little bit more rainfall. Final thoughts. Tissue testing, tissue sufficiency. You can do it, but the levels they are published, but there's a lot of variation in cultivars and plant growth stage. I don't know about time of day, but Clayton put that in there to make reliable nutrient management decisions based solely on tissue testing. Optical sensors like the Green Seeker. We've looked at this off and on for 10 years. Different people have looked at it. The problem in Montana conditions is that by the time the canopy is high enough that you get a good signal coming back, it's almost too late to fertilize with nitrogen to make up for it. So they haven't really figured out how to make that work very well. Micronutrients, combination deficiency symptoms, soil testing and tissue testing may be our best approach at identifying deficiencies. It's not an exact science. And remember, micronutrient deficiencies are an exception. They're usually not, you're never going to see it across the entire field that's going to be zinc deficient. You're going to see pockets, you're going to see areas that may have problems. And it may be a weather-related problem. They may come and go and disappear as weather warms up and as soil temperatures warm up and things start getting active again. And then the difference between toxic and being responsive and being toxic is pretty narrow. Something like boron, for example, you can easily over-apply and actually get to a toxic level that would keep you from making actually hurt you more than help you. And then the main challenge for something like that, you're trying to spread 1 or 2 pounds per acre, is getting it evenly distributed across a field or an area. So you can foliar apply it and maybe get there, but that's not a cheap solution, and it may not even correct the severe deficiencies. I think impregnated on the macro nutrients, I think some of that might be available. That if you really have a field that's constantly showing one of the micros is in deficiency, that would be a better approach, I think. Plant symptoms, if you look at nitrogen deficiency, It's like it is in any crop, the nitrogen is mobile, so the lower leaves tend to slough off yellow and the upper leaves steal the nitrogen from that. And overall, it's just a yellowing looking crop. Phosphorus, you tend to see these smaller plants or purpling. The microbes, a lot of times, is either interbanal or spotting like this. Potassium can be a smaller plant with some interbanal yellow. Sulfur, the one thing you notice with sulfur deficiency is this leaf cupping up towards the flowering plant. And also when they flower, there's just less flowers than what you would expect for a healthy plant. So something to look out for over time. So in summary, use soil tests, ensure nutrients are available before stem elongation, adjust nitrogen in season to reflect the growing season, need adequate sulfur to ensure nitrogen response. Low rates of seed-placed phosphorus and sulfur promote a healthy start. I think sulfur may be something you don't want to put in with the seed slot. Select appropriate timing and placement for giving fertilizer source. Beware of seed-placed fertility or fertilizer toxicity. And consider using a pulse crop before rotating to oilseed crops like canola. There's some guides. A lot of what this talk, especially the data on canola, came out of the soil nutrient management for canola that Plain put out in 2016. You can get this, the link for it is right here at the MSU Extension store. There's a site online, canolacouncil.org. It's got really good information. Look at the fertility part of this webpage and you'll get some good information from them. Flax is another one put here from the Flax Council in Canada. It would be a very good source and of good information. The Sunflower Association is a great source to get to other bulletins. They've got not just North Dakota, but Kansas State and Texas. There's all sorts of different ones. And so looking at those and comparing might be worthwhile. So the link to that is there. Safflower production, I found the one from North Dakota. I'll just let that go there. And then soybean production guide, this is North Dakota. There's also Kansas State has one that might be worthwhile. We used to have a production guide for camelina. Camelina is an oilseed crop, and there's some interest again in growing camelina in the region. I have copies if you want a copy from Montana State. We no longer have it at the store because it's about 13 years old. But Oregon State, this is a decent one to look at. Or if you need it, just email me and I can send you a copy. That's all I have. This is my information. You need to get a hold of me. Send me an email or give me a call. This is Plain's information. If you've got any questions down the road, I would say the first one to go to is him. Anything about today's presentation, I'd be glad to take questions now.
Great. Seeing no questions, I guess, Mr. McVay. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for the Great Montana Ag Rally. We hope that you found this session to be informative and helpful. Thanks to Dr. McVay and to Montana Sulfur and Chemical Billings for the support of MABA. And the next session of the rally will begin at 10:30 today. It will cover mental health in agriculture with Dr. Allison Brennan and Dr. Michelle Grokey, Extension Mental Health Specialist. Thanks everybody for being here today. Thanks, Mr. McVay.